Welcome to today's presentation of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Town Meeting for Saturday, May 20th. And what we're having a discussion of here is the second part of a discussion we actually started on Thursday in our Fireside Chat, which was called Truth or War. And this is Truth or War Part 2, How to Take Back Your Government. In the course of today's discussion, we are going to be visiting and revisiting certain areas of American history which are current history. And that's what we really talk about. There's no such thing as current events. And that's why people often get caught below the level of events. They don't have a conception of the historical context in which these events are occurring. So when we are hearing someone like the Russian Security Council head, Patrushev, talk about a radiation cloud heading toward Europe as a result of the Russians having destroyed some of the munitions, the depleted uranium munitions, while that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an extraordinary danger of radioactivity, while that's not the same thing as an atomic bomb, what they are pointing to is that there's a change in the war and in the character of the war. We are seeing a continual escalation. We are seeing a kind of lurching toward, or slouching toward, if you want to put it that way, World War III, a kind of out-of-step march in which all of the participants claim that that's not what's occurring, except some of the participants who are very, very clear that no matter what people are saying, that's precisely what is occurring. This, however, need not be a tragic situation. And one of the things we'll be visiting during the course of today is a speech that was made 60 years ago, this coming June 10th, by John Kennedy, President of the United States, at American University. Sometimes an individual rises above the limitations of public office and the fray of faction to speak on behalf of the future. And that's what Kennedy did on that occasion on June 10th of 1963. It's sometimes called the peace speech, and we will be referring in effect in context to this throughout. But in order to get us started today, we want to start immediately with the LaRouche Organization spokesman, Harley Schlanger. So Harley, let me go right to you.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. You're going to hear a lot today about the military-industrial complex and its evolution since the assassination of John F. Kennedy nearly 60 years ago. But this will not be the standard view that you get of military contractors hauling suitcases full of money in order to pay for building new weapon systems, coups, assassinations, and wars. That is definitely a part of the story. But what we'll be discussing is why the present-day military-industrial complex is so committed to continuing the war in Ukraine against Russia and opening a second front in Taiwan against China. And then, importantly, what can be done to rescue our republic from this military-industrial complex. So let's begin with what we mean when we say the military-industrial complex. This term was used by President Eisenhower, who was a military leader in World War II, whose presidency did a lot to build this up during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But in his farewell address made on January 17, 1961, just 3 days before John F. Kennedy's inauguration, he had the following to say, and he said, "We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. Its influence is economic, political, even spiritual, and is felt on nearly every level of government. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes." Now, the power of that establishment has increased many-fold since Eisenhower's speech during the period of the Cold War, and it intensified especially during the early 1980s. and again as the center of the post-Soviet Union rules-based order. This is an establishment that John Kennedy was fighting as president. And we believe that this is the main reason that he was killed. So we'll be discussing this in some detail. I'll have some more comments later, and I think it'll be important to hear what Ray Mcgovern has to say on this. So I'm going to turn this back over to Dennis.
Yes, I'd like to point out that the same day that Eisenhower gave that farewell address, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in Congo. This was an action which the soon-to-be president, John F. Kennedy, had particularly opposed, but was carried out nonetheless. And I reference this because many years ago, Lyndon LaRouche, when he was asked the question when the process of decomposition and unraveling of the United States began, used to say it began with the assassination of Lumumba. I think that's a relevant point to understand. It was something that caused great agony for the president. We may have a photo that we can show of that later about when he got the news of this. But it's relevant to talk about this because when you talk about and of course our next, when we get to Ray Mcgovern, he doesn't talk about a military-industrial complex. He thinks that's an outmoded conception. But often, in any case, people talk about something really big and really mysterious and really deep, things that they can't understand. But when you bring it down to the level of assassination, the International Assassination Bureau that also would later assassinate President Kennedy himself and his brother and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and others, then it becomes much more sensuous. And it's this that we have to also call attention to, the personal and individual side of all of this. What we're going to do now is show you a discussion that was not available in general on YouTube and so on, which was had by Robert Kennedy Jr. with Russell Brand. It's an interview. There's a discussion of Ukraine. And the reason that we're going to show this, other than the fact that Ray Mcgovern, who will be with us right after, will be commenting about what you're about to see, is because it is illustrative of the character of question and answer that is, we think, required for the American people to get an actual grasp of what is actually going on in the world today and how they ought to treat the presidential process and, for that matter, the political process as a whole. That rather than sound bites or advertising slogans, there needs to be a discussion in which real questions are asked and real answers are given. So we'll go to that now.
I have therefore chosen this time and place
So firstly, is it a humanitarian war? What's going on with the expenditure? How do you end these wars? What's going to be the impact of the escalating tensions between the US and Russia, and of course the agitation of China through the semiconductor Taiwan gear?
Well, we were sold on the fact that it was a humanitarian war, and we were sold using these kind of formulaic narratives that, Putin is the evil Hitler-like figure, or Saddam Hussein, or whoever it is, the one that we need to go to war, and that we are the good guys, and that it's a humanitarian war. But we have not been acting like it's a humanitarian war. And by the way, my own son went over there and was fighting over there. He fought, he was a machine gunner in a special forces unit. He joined the Foreign Legion and fought in the Kharkiv offensive, motivated by those impulses, by the humanitarian impulse, by the courage of the Ukrainian people, by the brutality of the Russian invasion, etc. And but if you look at the history of why, what's happened over there, and you go back a little bit in history, in 1990-91, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, we made a deal with Gorbachev, Britain and the United States, and it was over the reunification, which is a very dicey issue of Germany, because the Russians had 400,000 troops in East Germany. And we wanted to reunite East Germany under NATO, which had been the Russian enemy. So the Russians were naturally worried and said, if we take our troops out, we want to make sure that you're not getting a beachhead and you're not going to move NATO into all of our, former satellite states and make us feel like we're under attack, like we're being encircled. And President Bush famously told them, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles to the east, and we've incorporated 14 of the Russian former satellite states, and we've put nuclear missile capable systems, the Aegis missile system, which is manufactured by Lockheed in both Romania and Poland. And the Russians were terrified we'd put that in Ukraine, which is only 400 miles from Russia. And they repeatedly said to us, you cannot incorporate Ukraine into NATO. We then unilaterally walked away from our 2 intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with Russia. So we had treaties saying you can't use intermediate nuclear weapons. These were huge steps in progress, and we canceled both of them unilaterally. We told the Russians we're not doing that anymore. Surrounding these missile systems, we started practicing, incorporating Ukraine into interoperability with NATO forces. Zelensky runs in 2019. We helped to overthrow the democratically elected government of the Ukraine in 2014 and install a very ultra-nationalist, and that is a polite way of describing them, ultra-nationalist, government there that's extremely anti-Russian. That prompts the Russians to go in and invade Crimea because they're terrified that now that we have our own government in place there, we're going to put the naval of our U.S. Navy fleet in a warm water port that they've had for, I think, 370 years. It's their only warm water port. It's their way of, having a military presence on the Black Sea. They're terrified we're going to go in there, so they invade Crimea. Then the new Russian government comes in and enacts all of these oppressive laws against the ethnic Russian majority in eastern Ukraine. 80% of the people in the Donbass are ethnic Russians. And they were able to have their own language, and they felt part of the Ukraine. But suddenly there's all these laws being passed saying, that language is no longer any good. You have to speak Ukrainian, and treated essentially as redheaded stepchildren. And they start doing protests, and the government then reacts violently, and you basically have a civil war in which 14,000 ethnic Russians are killed. Put yourself in our position. I was here in 1962 when the Russians put nuclear missile sites in Cuba, and we were ready to invade, even though we didn't even know they had that they were armed at that point. And if they had also, if Mexico did that, we'd be in there in a second. If Mexico started killing American expatriates, 14,000 of them, we'd invade in a second. So we have a Monroe Doctrine that we've been forced for hundreds of years that says no other major power can put any military equipment in our hemisphere. Meanwhile, we've never been invaded. The Russians have been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time they were invaded during World War II, they were invaded through the Ukraine. 1 out of every 7 Russians was killed, 13% of the population. Russia was leveled. My uncle in 1963 gave his most important speech, the American University speech. And that speech, he tried to do what I'm doing right now. He told America, it was a speech to the American people, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the Russians and understand how they have a worldview. You have to put yourself in the shoes of your adversary. And he went through this history of the suffering that Russia had endured during World War II and explaining why it would want to have a legitimate claim to protect its borders. And the U.S., the Ukraine today is a victim of U.S. aggression as well, because Zelensky ran in 2019 here's a guy who's a comedian and an actor, and I'm not saying that in a disparaging way, Russell, please. I don't want you to hear that in a disparaging way. He's a comedian. He's a comedian.
I run Europe. Could work.
The reason I'm saying that is the only reason he won that election is he ran on a peace platform. he was going to ratify the Minsk Accords, which was the Russian-supported agreement. Donbass remains part of Ukraine, even though it had voted to join Russia. Russia said, we don't want them. They stay in Ukraine, but you need to protect them. You need to make them semi-autonomous so they're not getting killed. And Zelensky then gets in there. He gets surrounded by U.S. neocons, including most prominently Victoria Nuland. And she's the one who sort of orchestrated the U.S. walking away from all these nuclear treaties, and all of his peace professions suddenly disappear. And he is pressured by ultranationalists within Ukraine and by the U.S. government to start having a military response instead of going to the table with the Russians. And now we've pumped 113 million in there. It's a proxy war. And our government has admitted, President Biden has admitted that this, the old neocon aspiration, this war is about getting rid of Putin. And his Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, acknowledged in April 2022 that the war is about the U.S. purpose of engaging this war is to exhaust and degrade the Russian army so they're incapable of fighting anywhere else in the world. So that is our objective in this war. And it is a proxy war that is using the bodies of the flower of Ukrainian youth, putting them into an abattoir where they are being mercilessly killed. They aren't even admitting this. The Pentagon doesn't admit it. The Ukrainian government doesn't admit it. They have lost more than 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainians are trying to leave Ukraine, and it is now illegal to leave Ukraine if you're, below 55 years of age and a male. It is, and they've killed 14,000 civilians. It's 60% unemployment. The infrastructure of the country has been destroyed for U.S. geopolitical machinations, and it's not right. The Russians are killing Ukrainians at a rate of probably around 7-1, because they have a 10-1 artillery advantage. And we've killed between 30,000 and 100,000 Russians, which isn't something to be happy about either. None of this is stuff that we should be doing if we really wanted peace. But this is a war where Ukraine has been made a victim, not just by Russia, but by the United States government.
Ray Mcgovern's 27-year career as a CIA analyst includes serving as the chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch and the preparer and briefer of the President's Brief. He's co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and he's also a professional troublemaker and part-time classicist. He's with us today, and I'd like you, Ray, welcome, of course, to comment on what you've just seen, and of course, update us on the military-industrial complex.
Thanks, Dennis. As you know, I call it the Mickey Mat, okay? Not the MIC, the military-industrial complex, not the MIC, but the Mickey Mat. Got a pencil? Oh, that's archaic. Got a keyboard? Military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank, complex. Mickey Mat. Sort of rhymes a little with Mickey Mouse, but it's much more serious, just so you can remember it. Now, why did I say media, as if in all capital letters? Well, media is the linchpin. Without controlling the media, you can't do any of this stuff. And as Eisenhower also said in that farewell address, he said, look, this is a danger. This power that keeps growing by the military-industrial complex, whether, what was the word he used, whether sought or unsought, well, we know now it's sought, right? Lots of people getting very rich on these things, okay? The only antidote to that kind of accretion of power, sought or unsought, is a well-informed citizenry, We ain't got that now. If we had that, we would be able to read things like objective accounts of what happened in Kiev in February of 2014, when our government overthrew the duly elected government of the Ukraine and put in a bunch of people who were proto-Nazi and also anti-Russian. It's very clear. As a matter of fact, even some intelligence agencies rose to the occasion. No, I'm not kidding. Really. Here's an example. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which at that time was headed by a rather honest Marine general, had this to say in December of 2015, so almost 2 years after the coup in Kiev. This was a congressionally mandated report. It's very short. I'll just quote a couple of sentences from it. Listen closely. Quote, "The Kremlin is convinced that the United States is laying the groundwork for regime change in Russia. A conviction further reinforced by events in Ukraine. Moscow views the United States as the critical driver behind the crisis in Ukraine and believes that the overthrow of former Ukrainian President Yanukovych is the latest move in a long-established pattern of U.S. orchestrated regime change efforts, period," end quote. I won't read it again because I read it real slow and I hope you took notes. Okay. Now, what happened to this guy? Oh, I don't know. He certainly didn't get promoted. What happened to the Defense Intelligence Agency? Pushed aside. Now, part of their portfolio had to do with Russian military intelligence, right? Right. That was their job. Now, when John Brennan of the CIA and James Comey, the FBI, and a couple other folks like that decided to blame Russian military intelligence for hacking the DNC emails so damaging to Hillary Clinton, they forgot to include the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm kidding, of course. They deliberately excluded Defense Intelligence Agency, even though the GRU, the Russian Intelligence Organization, by writ, is under the DIA for analysis and reporting. So that's just kind of a sidelight to indicate what happens when you say something honest. There was a coup in Kiev. People have asked me, a deputy to the German foreign minister at the time, asked me in Berlin, what coup? I said, you were there. Steinmeier, your boss, was there. You know about the coup, and you're asking me, what coup? Yes, he said, what coup? I was on Amy Goodman a week or two after the coup, debating Timothy Snyder, who has quite a pedigree as a Yale professor. And when I mentioned the fact that the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt in Kiev were caught in an intercepted conversation plotting the coup, there's no doubt about the authenticity of the intercept conversation, that appeared on the 4th of February 2014 on YouTube. I thought, well, poor Yatsenyuk and poor these other guys who are all set to take over the Ukraine. It's not going to work now. The coup is blown. A tradecraft word, okay? When you blow a coup, you reveal it, it's not going to happen. That's what I thought. Apparently, that's what Vladimir Putin thought, because he stayed in Sochi for the Winter Olympics, didn't come back until the day after the coup. So the coup is central. The DIA, a year and a half, 2 years later, is saying the same thing. Really important point. Now, let me pick up on what RFK Jr. is saying about the deal with respect to Germany. A divided Germany, we're going to unite it. I have to confess that even though I've lived and worked in Germany for 5 years, when I heard that the concept of a reunited Germany was being talked about and being seriously considered, talking about 1989, 1990, I got a little jumpy. Why? I didn't want a reunited Germany. I knew a lot of history. I knew a lot of Germans. I'll say, some of my best friends are Germans, and that's true, but some others, not my best friends, all right? So I knew all that. I knew that the reason for NATO itself was to keep the Americans in Europe, keep the Russians out of Europe, and keep the Germans down, divided. So when this notion came into the fore, I had really mixed feelings, to say the least. Now, I'm an American. I lived through all of World War II, but I was too small to be a combatant. Nobody was shelled except those in Honolulu. Nobody lost their life or their treasure or their limb in my part of New York. We don't know what war is. And so it's easy enough to have a historic recognition of what happened during World War II. The Russians all have personal reminiscence, okay? Now, so here's Gorbachev, and here is James Baker, the Secretary of State to George H.W. Bush. And Baker is sent by Bush to work some sort of new European security arrangements out, okay? And so he says the first thing, and this is not me making stuff up, okay? Jack Matlock, who was ambassador then, has confirmed all this. What happened was James Baker, pretty slick lawyer from Texas, he says, Mr. Gorbachev, we would really like to have a reunited Germany. Now, put yourself in Gorbachev's place. The Russians lost 26 million plus citizens, including their army, during World War II. Put your mind around that, 26 million plus, at the hand of the Germans, Nazis, okay? So you're not asking McGovern, who doesn't know about war, you're asking Gorbachev, the head of a country that knows lots about war. You're saying, how about a reunited Germany? So Gorbachev says, well, that's a bitter pill to swallow. What's the deal? What's the quid? What's the quo for this quid? And then James Baker does a little Texas dance, and he says, well, how would it be? And I have this directly from Jack Matlock, with whom I worked in Washington this time. How would it be if we said that we wouldn't move NATO 1 inch to the east of the East German border with that? How would that be? And but Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, his foreign minister, they said, well, let us sleep over it. They came back the next day. Now, the Russians were really down, okay? The place was falling apart. They needed a lot of economic aid, and there was a modicum of trust for George H.W. Bush, who had met with Gorbachev in Malta the previous January, the month before. No, it was in December, actually, the month before. And they had, Bush had said, look, Mikhail, I'm not going to dance on what's left of the Berlin Wall, okay? We still want a Europe free and full from Portugal to Vladivostok. So this is a matter of trust there. So Gorbachev says, okay, now if you promise, you say you're not going to move NATO. Okay, well, we have, they had 400,000 troops in East Germany. Who's going to pay for all that stuff? Bring them back well, Russia paid for all that stuff, okay? So it was a big, big deal. And I only emphasize that because that promise was reneged upon. Now, many years later, about 7 years ago now, I was in Moscow, and I had a chance to talk to Kuvaldin. That's his name, Viktor Borisovich Kuvaldin. He was one of Gorbachev's main lieutenants at all those negotiations. And we were having drinks, actually. It was a little reception. And I went up to him and we were talking. And I said, Mr. Kuvaldin, tell me, why wasn't that promise written down? I mean, I didn't say this to Kuvaldin, but my father was a lawyer. He said once, he said 1,000 times, get it in writing, Ray. Get it in writing, for God's sake. So I said to Kuvaldin much more gently, why didn't you get it in writing? He looked me straight in the eye. He said, well, the two usual answers are, number one, the Germans hadn't completely bought into this yet. Marginally true. Number two, the Warsaw Pact still existed, for God's sake. True. But they looked me in the eye and says, Mr. McGovern, the real reason is because we trusted you. So that was back in 1990, okay? And the Soviet Union imploded the next year. And when Putin much later said the greatest tragedy of the implosion of the Soviet Union, when he said it was a great tragedy, he said he meant that millions, 25, 30 millions of Russians remained in some other country, like Ukraine, unprotected from people like the folks that took over when we arranged the coup in Kiev. Let me switch gears for a second and just comment on how well informed Robert Kennedy seems to be on all this. It's kind of refreshing to hear a presidential candidate able to know and recite some facts that happen to be relevant without a teleprompter, without any notes. I think that he is out to don the mantle of his uncle. And I know that Dennis Speed and Harley and all the others of you have been focusing in on the assassination and on what Robert Kennedy said about who killed his uncle and who almost certainly killed his father. I mean, you can see where he might feel a little strongly about these things, like, again, personal experience rather than reading books or speculating. Now, I have a wonderful book here I'm going to recommend. I've already recommended JFK and the Unspeakable. Whoops, how'd it go? No, this way. There it goes. By James Douglas. But this one is really good in its own way. It's around for 20 years plus, and here it is. History will not absolve us, okay? It's written by E. Martin Schultz. And I just want to quote just a very little bit from it. Right up front, he quotes Gaten Fonzi, who says this, and this is really important, so please wrap your mind around this, because this will explain why it's so hard to face the facts. Why it's so hard to face the facts. Today, most Americans believe there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy, but they don't know that. They don't want to know that. And our government doesn't want to know it. And our elective representative, they don't want to know it, because knowing it would mean having to do something about it. And that is an awesome thought. It's really awesome, isn't it? When we see the role played by our national security state in trying to fix elections, in interfering in domestic affairs to a fare thee well. Witness what's coming out in these recent weeks about FBI involvement and CIA involvement in all kinds of illegal and unconscionable activities having to do with picking presidents, or if they don't succeed in picking their preferred person, emasculating the president that gets in. Now, just to finish off, I have to tell you that this book, History Will Not Absolve Us, Orwellian Control, Public Denial, and the Murder of President Kennedy, is put together by a psychiatrist. Okay, a psychiatrist. That helps me understand why he has some insights that I don't. I'm going to quote, in this book is the text of the Kennedy speech before American University on the 10th of June, 1963. I had just joined the intelligence agency, the CIA, in April. So 2 years later, here comes Kennedy up to American University, and he says, and I'm going to pick out just a couple of sentences that relate to the Ukraine today, okay? I'm going to put my glasses on and probably be able to do it better. Total war. Here's John Kennedy, June 10th, 60 years ago. Total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to such forces. Nothing has changed in the ensuing 60 years. Here's one on the same subject. Nuclear powers must avert confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in a nuclear age would evidence a collective death wish for the world. So, well, the implications, I'm not going to talk down to you and explain the implications of that for what's going on in Ukraine right now. Let's hope that the sophomores that are advising Biden have a chance to think these thoughts. Finally, I'd just like to say some of the things that John Kennedy said. Here you go, quote, "As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and integrity. Whoa. But among the many traits the peoples of both Russia and we have, none is stronger than a mutual abhorrence of war." And I would sort of interject here that Russians know war in a more immediate sense than I hope Americans will ever know. So, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war, almost unique among major world powers. We have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle has ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the course of World War II. Finally, we all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Now, before I stop, I just want to tell you how this translates today to a situation where people who know pretty much what's going on have to speak out more forcefully, have to do things more, well, with more pizzazz, interventions being one way to call attention to these things. But what I've seen is some very, very useful declarations, a whole full-page ad in the New York Times just this week, which has an excellent, excellent rendition of how we got where we are now in Ukraine. It calls for a ceasefire and negotiations. Very sensible. Now, a lot of my colleagues signed that statement. I'm proud of them. I was asked, well, where's your signature? I said, look, this is a great thing to get in the New York Times to educate people. Obviously, either you couldn't say the whole truth or you don't know the whole truth. But when you imply, as this statement does, that Putin had other options back in February 2000 and last year, February 2024, when you imply that, I have to ask you to be honest. Like what? Like what other options? And when I ask very well-educated people that, they don't really come up with anything that approaches a convincing answer. In a word, the Ukrainian army, having been trained for 7 years and equipped with NATO weaponry, the strongest NATO army in Europe, was about to pounce on Russian-speaking people in Donbass, and they were about to do that, getting ready to do that in January, February of 2022, last year. Russians knew that, of course. I mean, they're right next door. Not only the Russians knew it, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, they knew it too, and they reported it. You didn't know that? Well, blame it on the media. So, there was one proximate cause of why Putin decided, well, if I don't protect Russian-speaking people, part of those 25 million that unfortunately ended outside Russia, if I don't protect them, well, I'm not really protecting Russian people, okay? Better to protect them now than later. I'm under a lot of criticism because, as Putin, have actually admitted, we should have done this back in 2014, right after the coup. Donetsk and Lugansk pleaded with us, please incorporate us into Russia. You incorporated Crimea, why not us? And Putin's, no, work it out. And we're going to get together with these Minsk Accords. They've promised to give you some autonomy. And guess what? That was another promise reneged upon. And we have Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Pyotr Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself not only admitting it, bragging about it. We diddled Putin for 7 years, and look at our army now, okay? So that was one factor. Another factor is something that I've written and spoken about. That has to do with the emplacement of missilery in Romania and Poland, and what they intended to do in Ukraine. I don't think that's going to happen now. Missilery capable of striking Moscow, 7 minutes now, with hypersonic missiles, 5 minutes. I have a whole lecture on that. You can see that on my website, raymcgovern.com. And the third factor, which I've been saying from the beginning, is that I don't think Putin would have felt able to do what he did in invading Ukraine had he not gotten Xi Jinping to take his back. I went up there on the 4th of February, went up to Beijing and said, look, this is what's happening. The Americans are reneging on their promise not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. They got them going into Poland, into Romania. We've got this imminent offensive by a fully equipped and trained Ukrainian army into Donbass. I'm going to have to do a limited military operation. What do you think? And this is not funny stuff. But here are the Olympics, the 4th of February, launched. Putin is there for the launch. And I can well see Xi Jinping saying, Vladimir, you mean you would do this after the Olympics are over, right? And Putin said, oh, right, okay. They're over on the 22nd of February, 23rd of February. Donetsk and Lugansk ask for recognition as independent countries. Moscow renders that recognition on the 24th. Putin sends his forces into Donbass. I mean, no coincidence those dates, and no coincidence that the Chinese, as I like to put it, they gave Putin a waiver on Westphalia, 1648, if you remember your history. You're not supposed to attack other people. You're supposed to consider other borders inviolate. Even Chinese rhetoric for the next month or two stressed not Westphalia, but that each country defending its core interests must be looked on its own merits in what it does. So China and Russia are now this close together. That is of overwhelming importance. That's a tectonic shift, and it was all brought about by these very smart people that are advising Biden about what to do. So with respect to what lies in store here, I just think that this anniversary, 60 years since President Kennedy got up and said, look, we all breathe the same air. We all want good things for our children. None of us want war. I think that needs to be raised, and it looks like RFK Jr. is not only well equipped with facts, but with the mantle that he wears as JFK's nephew and Bobby's son, to start a conversation that will educate people if that mainstream media, the crooks of the Mickey Mat, is forced to recognize this. Now, I'll finish on an optimistic note. I think about 3-4 weeks ago, there were polls saying, Bobby Kennedy got 20%. 20%. All right. Okay. Last week, there was one that says, wait a second, now he's got 36%. What does Biden have? Oh, he's got, wait a second, 37%? Now, well, my point is simply this. If Bobby Kennedy can do that without any major media attention worth the word, my God, apparently all these interviews he's given to various and sundry are having an effect. And so to the degree truth is important to all of us, we need to make sure that these interviews get wide circulation and people can judge for themselves, despite what the major media will say about this new person who come to the fore here with special credentials, special grievances, special interests that seem to parallel the interests of many of the rest of us. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ray. And we want to ask that if you can, you stay and make a second commentary. I know your time is very limited, but the reason for this is that you have an appreciation for the idea of classical tragedy as well as poetry. And there's a story I want to reference, which I don't think people know. You know, The father of Greek tragedy is said to be Aeschylus. Only 7 of his tragedies survive, but notably, there is nothing on the gravestone of Aeschylus that talks about his authorship of tragedy. What his gravestone says is, "Beneath this stone lies Aeschylus, son of Euphorion, the Athenian, who perished in the wheat-bearing land of Gela. Of his noble prowess, the grove of Marathon can speak, and the long-haired Persian knows it well." Aeschylus is probably the most famous person to have fought at Marathon. And that's what he had on his tombstone. Now, I want to take this up by and this is a quick segue, because there's a reference to this idea, not about Aeschylus, but about the idea of politics as art. And this is from Lyndon LaRouche, written in 2000, beginning of an article in which he says, "Some winced or giggled when the amiable and gifted Senator Eugene McCarthy conducted political campaigning as poetry reading sessions. I laugh happily at what he did. Senator McCarthy's critics did not remember, as I do, that President Lincoln had won a terrible, justified, and absolutely necessary war on behalf of all humanity by aid of lessons adduced from Shakespeare, which he had taught as directives to the members of his cabinet. No one, friend or foe, laughed at the awesome result of that instruction. Real politics as Plato and the recently elevated great and martyred English statesman Thomas More rightly understood, is properly practiced as a form of classical art." And of course, Plato is Aeschylus was earlier. I think he died in 455. Plato wasn't born until 427, but Plato was, of course, the most famous student of Socrates. What I want to do is to now make available Lyndon LaRouche's clinical demonstration of what he was talking about and why he thought this principle of tragedy was so important. And this is a short clip from a 1990s discussion. It was during the Clinton administration. And LaRouche was giving an illustration concerning the question of Hamlet, Clinton, and classical tragedy.
As you may perceive, I'm not concerned so much with running for office, though I'm very serious about running for office. At my age, you cannot afford to waste time on things you're not serious about. But the point is, I'm not interested in some, people treat election campaigns like they were sports events. Who won the thing, who got the gold medal. And I don't know whether you call that gong show on the Republican side a sports event or not. It's all going to come down to dole. They're all going to be gonged out pretty soon. We had Phil Graham go to milligram and then to microgram and then to nanogram. But I'm in the process of making a revolution by trying to evoke from the American people a movement which is based on the kinds of things I've discussed. The problem, we got two problems. Number one, people say, let's blame government. Let's blame those in power. I know all about that. I've seen that. That's not the problem. The problem, people aren't willing to sacrifice something else, which I'll be dealing with this Saturday. The case of Hamlet, as I'll deal with it Saturday, just in passing and dealing with something else, which is advertised. Hamlet, the great tragedy, which is the tragedy of us all. We could call it the President Clinton as Hamlet. Now think about President Clinton as Hamlet, or a potential Hamlet, who can go down in blood the way Hamlet did in the drama. And think of Shakespeare as a great artist, not an entertainer, but a great thinker. a great artist, a master tragedian. Here's Hamlet. Hamlet, you start this scene on the parapet. And these two guards are talking on the parapet of this Danish palace. And that's not Danish the kind you eat, it's another kind. And in comes Hamlet into the picture, and he thinks he sees the ghost of his dead father. And he wonders if the spirit I've seen is real or if it's some trick of the devil to deceive him. And you see in that moment the germ of a conflict. Then you come along toward the end of Act 2. And Hamlet has brought some players on to rehearse them to see if they can act this play about Hecuba. And the players leave, and they've exhibited great passion. And he says, I wonder if this player here who just left the room here wept. Could he weep for Hecuba? Could I weep for Hecuba? What is Hecuba to him? Yet I peak like John at dreams, unpregnant of my cause, and can do nothing. I must be pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. Or I have fattened the regent kites with his slaves often, referring to his enemies. Then it comes to the next act. There's an opening scene, and Hamlet goes to this famous soliloquy, to be or not to be. And there's a very interesting double play here it goes on. To be or not to be, that's the subjunctive. That's not in the indicative mood. It's a subjunctive mood. This state or that state. To be or to be. Two different states of mind. What are the two states that we find out in the unfolding of this soliloquy? In one state, there's death. The bourne from which no traveler has returned. But that's not the only issue. It's not he's just afraid of dying in the struggle. Something else. To be dead or alive, or to be something else. We would rather bear the ills we have than those we know not. And so Hamlet, in this point, has made a decision to die. And he says to Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery, go. I have nothing more to do with you. I'm dead, I'm doomed. I've made the decision to doom myself because I would rather bear the ills I have than those of which I know not. And that's typical American. That's Clinton. It's his pragmatic worst. Rather bear the certainty of winning the next election than worrying about the fate of the nation or the world. And it might come to the point he realizes, yes, maybe the world's monetary system is doomed, but I can't say that. I can deal with this because this is something I can understand, or my pragmatic friends in the DNC, or my campaign advisors can understand, or the Democratic Party, otherwise, or in the Congress. And I'm going to cling to these trodden, acceptable ways to win an election, even if it means the death of the United States. Because I dare not risk that which I do not understand. And that's the problem with most American people, not Clinton. Clinton is a leader. He's elected to be a leader. The nation is in great trouble, as was the nation of Denmark in the time of Hamlet. But Hamlet, who was the leader who might have changed the destiny of the nation, could not act because he could not go from the habitual to the unknown, the uncertain. And so that's Clinton's problem right now. That's his Hamlet problem, which I've got to get him out of because he's president. Otherwise the whole nation can go, as in the last act, the last scene of Hamlet. A bloody carnage, they're all dead. The problem lies with the people, because there's leadership and there's the people. Are the people willing to look in themselves and see what it was in them, which, as I've said repeatedly, step by step, drop by drop, drip by drip, over the past 30 years, the American people have drifted into conventions and accepted ways of doing things which have now brought us to the point of destruction. Not because Washington imposed it upon them, but because they voted for the people who did it. They voted to support the policies which they curse, whose results they curse. Can I get people to look in themselves and see the evil in themselves? The Hamlet in themselves. Because if I can't do that, I can't get the American people to make the kind of decisions which they must make in choosing leadership to get us out of this mess. They won't even respond to a competent leader. They would rather die as a nation than respond to a competent leader who challenges them to give up those habits of belief by which they are being destroyed.
So, Ray, if you're still there, I don't know if you are, but if you are, I'd like you to comment on this issue of classical tragedy. If you are not, we'll go to Harley. Oh, there you are. Very good. I didn't see you on the screen.
I'm here.
And so the issue really for me is this broader idea, because you recite poetry, you sing, you have constant classical references, you do these things, whether you're at the Oxford Union or you're confronting somebody like Donald Rumsfeld, if you happen to think about it at the time. So for you, when you are thinking and trying to think about your actions in politics, why and how does this principle of the ideas of classical tragedy, how does it work for you? And also whatever you may have to say about the particulars in the clip, whatever that might be.
Well, Dennis, I appreciate your bringing that up. The key, of course, not only in Shakespearean tragedy, but in Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, is the tragic flaw of hubris. Hubris, Greek word meaning overweening pride, self-satisfaction, sort of like people who go to the best schools and find themselves in positions of privilege and power. Sort of like the folks that are advising President Biden right now. So suffice it to say that the tragic flaw of hubris did in many a tragic hero. As a matter of fact, there was regularly there. The only thing that saved many of them was something that was later called in Latin a deus ex machina. Now, many are familiar with that phrase, but you know what it means? It means that in some of these tragedies, the hero is in such trouble that only God could save him. And so they had a big derrick on the side of the stage, and it would go over the hero, drop down a rope, and pluck that hero up through this machine. So Deus, God, out of a machine. Okay? Now, the problem is, as I see it, that we can't wait for any Deus ex machina. The situation is staring us right in the face. We're even closer to nuclear confrontation now than we were 60 years ago when John Kennedy made that speech. He was fresh from when it almost happened, What was the September before the Cuban Missile Crisis? So both he and Khrushchev knew what was so close and that they were able to prevent. So what's my lesson from all this? I think we have to not only be aware of people like Hamlet and the Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles heroes, but the heroes closer at hand. We have to kind of be modest enough and vulnerable enough to heed their warnings. Now, one prophet I have in mind, you have heard me cite him before. His name is Daniel Berrigan. He's a Jesuit priest, and for those of you who didn't know, he was one of the first and most ardent protester against the Vietnam War, spent lots of years in jail because of that. Now, he wrote poetry, okay? And he wrote warnings to various people, and I'd like to just finish commenting on this from something he wrote that was called No Bars to Manhood. Okay, here it is. Quote, "Let us have peace," we cry. But at the same time, let everything remain normal. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison, nor ill repute, nor disruption of ties with family and friends. There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no peacemakers because the making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bring disgrace, prison, and even death in its wake. Finally, what about the children? We all hope for the best for our children, Russians, Americans, whomever. Dan Berrigan spent Holy Week just before Easter Sunday in South Africa about 45 years ago now. And he spoke in white churches, the only place he was allowed to speak, and he braced them with his message of justice for all people, black and white. He encouraged them to do precisely this, to resist, to risk disruption of ties with family and friends. He asked them to become peacemakers and justice makers because there was all too few in South Africa. Now, here's the point. At the end of his sermons, at the end of the Mass, he would stand outside as he usually did and shake hands with some of the churchgoers. And some of them said, "But Father Berrigan, if we do that, what you suggest, we're going to get in trouble, maybe get arrested, and then what becomes of our children?" And Berrigan writes in his biography, "So I said to them, and if you don't do that, what then becomes of your children?" Oh, those of us who have children, those of us who have family, that we may have to disagree on some things about, we do it in love, but we do it with a little pizzazz. The time is short. Dr. King was right in saying there is such a thing as too late. It's getting to be that hour. Let's do it, all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. And I know you may not have much more time yourself right now. So let me simply ask Harley, is there anything you'd like to address to Ray before he gets going?
Well, I have a few things to say, but I think it's clear that Ray's reflection about this question of who's going to do it. And the thing about tragedy is that while we learn the tragic heroes have flaws, as Lynn was saying, those flaws are often reflected in the population. And the population is more than happy to watch the tragic heroes go down rather than disrupt their normal life. And I think I would say that's the lesson in the story Ray just told us about Father Berrigan, saying to those people, if you wish to have a future for your children, you have to be willing to disrupt your normal life. And these are the kinds of times where the heroes will have to come from the people, because they're not going to come from the establishment.
Well, I'd just like Ray to know, first of all, to thank you, Ray, for being with us. But what we're going to do now is show about 4 minutes of the JFK American University speech, precisely because it is not a tragic speech. One can choose to not be tragic. And that's precisely what JFK did. I also, just as a personal note, like to point out to people that the next day, President Kennedy gave his civil rights speech. So that was a speech in which he challenged the entire segregation establishment of the South, which was the bedrock of the Democratic Party, which would have been the bedrock of a constituency he needed to be reelected in 1964. And it's important, sort of, for those who wouldn't have been around at the time, as I was and Ray was as well, to note as we did in the black community, that trip down to Dallas was already, people were already nervous because of the issue of the Civil Rights Act. So this is within 24 hours, the two speeches occur. We'll see an excerpt from the June 10th American University speech. And as Ray also said, and was referenced by Robert Kennedy Jr. specifically as the most important speech, perhaps, that JFK gave, that the fact that you have any candidates that say that they want to do what that speech does, if you have that going on in today's America, then there's no reason for any of us to be tragic. I mean, whomever you decide to vote for or not even vote, whatever, there's no reason for us as a people to be tragic. So thank you very much, Ray. And now we'll show that 4 minutes of the American University speech.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
All right, so Harley, we're back to you, and comments both, of course, on that, but you have other remarks as well. Take it away.
Okay, well, seeing that speech again, it reminds us of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been saying in the last days, which is that that's the kind of attitude, the kind of outlook that existed in the presidency of John Kennedy and in the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt coming out of the war. And that should have been sustained through the present day. And we would have avoided a lot of the destruction that's been unleashed on the world by the American and NATO war machine had that outlook been the dominant outlook of our political leaders and of our people. And I just want to review, going back to the beginning, that what we're dealing with in the military-industrial complex is something bigger than just the defense contractors. It's true, Kennedy was fighting against the defense contractors, but also against the military brass and the intelligence community. But he was also fighting against Wall Street. He had his battles with Wall Street. And we can see in today's military-industrial complex, the Mickey Mat that Ray was talking about, how that emerged after the Kennedy assassination as a much more powerful, dominant force in American life. Today, the so-called rules-based order, which Blinken repeatedly talks about, the idea of a unipolar world where the United States is the sole hegemon, that is not just a military concept, but comes out of the organization of corporate cartels that dominate policy of the Western nations. This includes financial interests, banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, the so-called too big to fail banks that control the Federal Reserve and control the International Monetary Fund. It includes the grain cartels and the meat packing companies and the food cartels which control what we eat. It's the think tanks that produce volumes of material about why we have to go to war against Russia. And it's also organizations such as Big Pharma, the for-profit health industry, big tech, and the media cartel. Now, in the post-Soviet era, the tentacles of these cartels control everything. And this goes back to the idea of the trusts that existed before World War I and then reemerged after World War I and were involved in installing Adolf Hitler in power in Germany. For what reason? To make sure that Germany and Russia never were united as a Central European force that could influence the policy of Eurasia and the rest of Western Europe. And so when we look at the world today through the eyes of geopolitics, what we can see is that what's going on in Ukraine is not a defense of freedom or a protection against authoritarianism, because there's certainly more authoritarianism in the policies of Western governments today than the so-called democracy which they claim to support. So there are two aspects that have to be addressed as to understand why there's such an obsessive commitment to continue the war and extend it also against China, and to continue the war in Ukraine regardless of the destruction of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. So let me just go to the first point, which is the one most people identify with when you talk about the military-industrial complex, which is war is a racket. People make money in war. This is definitely the case. And the corporate cartels, which fund both parties in the United States, as well as most of the parties in Europe, are recipients of much of the hundreds of billions of dollars going into these wars and the manufacture of new systems for the future wars. Now, there's a statement which actually exposes the appeal of greed, which I'm going to read to you, which comes from the current war in Ukraine, from the Zelensky government. And this was in the Ukrainian national news agency, Ukrinform, which wrote an article titled "The Night of Downed Kinzhals." Now, what this says is that the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles from Russia were destroyed by the Western anti-aircraft system. And they go on to say that the weapons, quote, that Russian propagandists have been scaring the whole world with for years are impotent. Russia claims that the Patriot system was knocked out, which in fact the Americans have admitted. But this article goes on to say, but who would believe this? Only the Russian plebs. The world has also seen that to be afraid of such weapons is to disrespect yourself. And they have a number of quotes, but they have one from Sergei Fursa, who I believe is in the defense sector of the Ukrainian government. And he asks, or he says, the questions of which technologies are stronger and whether Russian weapons are capable of competing with American systems has been put to rest. So if anyone in the Western world was still afraid of Russian weapons, now they should finally realize that there is nothing to be afraid of. Is he not taking into consideration nuclear weapons? Of course not. And he goes on to say, and if anyone in the United States still doubted whether to give Ukraine the latest weapons, they have also received an answer. In other words, these weapons are doing the job. We should provide more weapons. The article concludes by saying, each delivery of several $billion worth of weapons to Ukraine will bring hundreds of billions of dollars worth of orders for the American arms corporations in the future. European manufacturers also see this, and so they are also motivated to push their governments to provide Ukraine with more and more modern weapons, which will destroy the remaining myths about the power of Russian weapons, unquote. This is like an advertising copy for the military-industrial complex, but what it does show is the appeal to the corporate greed, which is one part of why these wars continue. But the second aspect is the one that the Schiller Institute has been explicitly focused on in the many years in addressing the problems of American and NATO foreign policy. And that is the opposition to the idea of a unipolar order that insists that every nation must submit to the economic needs of that unipolar order, of that so-called rules-based order. Now, what's happening today is that rules-based order itself is collapsing. You know, despite the bravado in this article that Ukraine is going to win, give them more weapons, and their weapons are more powerful than the Russian weapons, despite that, it's very clear that this is a war of total destruction which could provoke a nuclear World War III. But we're seeing opposition emerging to this unipolar order. The financial system is collapsing. It's overloaded with claims of worthless financial instruments. There's not enough money printing that can go on to bail out the collapsed banks and corporations. Now, at the same time, the demands are that the entire world must submit to the needs that the bankrupt corporations have to stay in business, which means more free trade, more looting, more slave labor around the world. But that's not going to happen, because as we see this system collapsing, so do the people in the global south. And what they see also is that Russia and China will not submit to these demands, that they give up their sovereign interests in order to protect a collapsing system. Now, Iraq didn't submit, but they were destroyed. The country was brutalized by barbaric military tactics. And there should have been a number of Western leaders brought up for war crimes, because that was a war that was based on false pretenses. Now, we also saw Libya. You know, what was Gaddafi's crime? He gave up weapons of mass destruction. He used the oil money that his country was raising to build hospitals, schools, a man-made lake to provide water to increase agricultural productivity. And how was he repaid? As the cackling Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died. That's the rules-based order. to defend a system that's collapsing. What was Gaddafi's other crime? He was talking about an African monetary union of regional currencies backed by oil, by gold, by some physical good, which would have broken with the dollar system. Syria, the same thing. Why regime change in Syria? Because the commitment was to destroy a regime, a government, that existed based on the idea of economic development of the whole country. But the people of Syria stood up and fought. Unfortunately, the people of Ukraine did not when the coup was carried out in Ukraine in February 2014. Now, why else is the unipolar order collapsing? Well, sanctions. When you don't go along with the demands of the economic royalists, you face being cut off for credit. Children dying for lack of medicine, lack of food. If you continue to insist on resisting the rules-based order, you get bombed or attacked. Now, we're seeing, because of the ability of Russia and China to stand up and defend the interests of their people as a priority, other governments are doing the same. And this is what the BRICS represents. This is what the Belt and Road Initiative is building, the idea that there can be economic development, if necessary, outside of the dollar system. It's not an attempt to get outside of the dollar system. The Chinese repeatedly offered to the West cooperation. Join us, help us develop Africa, help us develop Latin America, help us develop Asia. And instead, they were attacked from the West, supposedly for imposing unpayable debt on the countries they were helping. Well, it's the West that imposed the unpayable debt. That's what IMF conditionalities are. And so nations are moving out from under this unipolar order. And so you see it's not just that money is to be made from war, but the system itself is now being protected or thought to be protected by these wars to defeat the opponents to the continuation of this unipolar order. And so the fact that the global south, countries such as Algeria and Nigeria and Brazil and Argentina and Indonesia and Malaysia are resisting is a sign that the killing in Ukraine is for no purpose, because ultimately they're not going to succeed in destroying the desire of nations for their development of their populations. They're not going to be able to weaken China. And so you have a situation where the world is moving in one direction and the military-industrial complex at large is fighting a battle from a weak position. Now, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in a statement the other day is that the policies of the military-industrial complex, the rules-based order, doesn't represent the interests of the nations of the global south, nor does it represent the interests of the people that it supposedly is representing, namely the people of the United States, or of Ukraine, or of Germany. How do you defend the interests of Germany when you blow up their pipelines, eliminating their access to cheap energy? So go back to the words of John F. Kennedy, which you just heard. We have a chance now to return to the better instincts in American foreign policy, which were expressed by Kennedy. The idea of peace and development for all people. Not just an end to war for Americans, but for all nations. And this was the policy of peaceful cooperation. This is a policy of economic development. And it was the policy that was initiated shortly after that speech of moves toward arms control. Now, the program for this today has been elaborated for many years by Lyndon LaRouche and has been added to by the work of Helga Zepp-LaRouche. The idea of economic development based on physical economic production a rejection of the power of the central banks that are private banks, and instead a credit system which provides the capability for nations to develop, and an end to the blackmail of sanctions and war. Now, let me just conclude by pointing something out that I think should be on the minds of many of you. We've just seen recently 2 examples of a complete rejection of the policies that we in the United States have lived under for the last 6 years. The lies of Russiagate, which were just exposed again in the Durham report, which showed that it was an illegal cooperation between the Clinton campaign, the media, and the intelligence community and the Obama administration to run Russiagate to try to defeat Donald Trump and to defeat Putin. But we also had the Girth report, a New York Times reporter who wrote an article, The Press versus the President, that was in the Columbia Journalism Review, which made the same argument, which showed how the media in its reporting was using stories coming from the very people who were running the operation as a political opposition. And the fact is that none of what they were saying was truthful. Now, the reason I bring this up is, will we have to wait 4 or 5 years to get the truth about the corruption that's propelling us toward a possible nuclear World War III? Because if we do have to wait for 4 or 5 years, we may not be around to receive that truth. And so we listen to what Lyndon LaRouche said about Hamlet. And the problem is not just that we have bad leaders, which we do, corrupt leaders, leaders who are functioning on behalf of these private special interests against the constitutional guarantees in the United States or the project or the programs of other nations to provide for their people, but to enrich themselves at the risk of blowing up the planet. So we have bad leaders. But as Lyndon LaRouche said, instead we have to look in ourselves and find the good to overcome the Hamlet in ourselves, which tells us, don't rock the boat. Things may be bad, but they could get worse. Well, they could get a lot worse. But, as Dennis has been saying, this is not an inevitable tragedy. They could also get much better. And we're in the position now in the West to join with the global South, to join with the Russians and the Chinese, to join with the people of Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, to create a new strategic and development architecture for mankind. And that's why when you listen to the words of John F. Kennedy, and you see the courage now of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., that this points to something different for America, but it's up to us to realize it.
And I think what we'll do is go directly to questions. There's several of them, so I'll just start us right out. Okay, this is from Jerry Halloran. It says, the 1963 JFK peace speech said a lot like when he spoke of Soviet propaganda concerning the imperialist circles that intended different kind of warfare and the agenda to enslave Europe and other capitalist nations. Let me just let people know this refers to the whole speech, which we did not show. The whole speech is 26 minutes. Sounds exactly like what we have today via the EU and NATO. It seems the Russian people knew something back then that has proved to be somewhat true today, and that President Kennedy didn't know who the real enemy was, so forth and so on. The global majority of nations would have no problem with JFK's June 10th speech. Only the imperialist drivers of war today would have a very good reason to kill JFK, and should they be exposed outright for their crimes against humanity and dealt with appropriately? That's sort of the question.
Well, let me say something about that by broadening the topic, because it wasn't just the assassination of John F. Kennedy. As you mentioned earlier, Lumumba, the leader of Congo, was assassinated, the leader of the anti-colonial revolt in Congo. There were attempts against Charles de Gaulle. There were waves of assassinations in Italy. Mattei in 62, I believe, Aldo Moro in 1977 or 78. There was terrorism constantly launched during these periods, which often point to NATO as the originator of the terrorism. And much of this goes back to the same networks, the Dulles networks, who helped Nazis from the defeated war from Germany to escape to other countries and provide their services to the CIA and to the British. Bandera, for example, the Ukrainian ultra-nationalist Nazi, who is the banner with his picture is marched behind by the leaders of the defense and security forces of Ukraine today. They were all brought out to the West as part of an operation run by Alan Dulles, the same Alan Dulles who ran the Bay of Pigs and who covered up, through his role in the Warren Commission, the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. So what we're dealing with here is an international assassination bureau. And when you see today the cowardice of the leadership in Germany, the unwillingness to have the Bundestag conduct an investigation into the Nord Stream pipelines, the refusal of the media in most of the West to give any honest coverage of the Seymour Hersh reporting on the Nord Stream pipelines, the refusal to expose what I call the disinformation industrial complex, which has been putting out the lies about what went into the Ukraine war, what's going on in China, and so on. This is what we're combating. Now, in that sense, when you understand it's an international fight, then you realize the importance of why they're targeting Russia and China and why they're so angry that the global South is not going along with them. But what it does mean is that there is a potential in the West today in building a new peace movement, but not just as an anti-war movement. And this is why the question of Kennedy is important, because he was committed in the second part of his administration, that is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in not only achieving peace with the Soviet Union, but of withdrawing forces from Vietnam, not giving in to the Joint Chiefs who wanted to go to war in Laos. And the fact that there's a candidate for president in the Democratic Party with the name of Kennedy, who's raising these issues, is extremely important. And so if we see this not just as something that has to do with the United States, but with a global struggle where we can draw upon the strengths of other nations, such as what China is doing with its Belt and Road Initiative to lift people of Africa out of poverty. That's what Kennedy had in mind when he gave speeches in the late 1950s as a senator from Massachusetts, attacking the colonial system. People don't know that he was doing that. People have some vision of Kennedy as being close to the British. But in fact, he was very critical of all European colonialism. And so I think this question of the better tradition of American policy, which is largely unknown because what we're being bombarded with today in the so-called wokeism is the idea that the United States has always been an oppressor, has always been, in a sense, it's treated in the image of the British. Now, the British Empire is real. The United States had a struggle throughout most of its history between an imperial tendency and the tradition of the Founding Fathers as a constitutional republic. So that's what we have to revive, that kind of thinking that's expressed in the Kennedy speech. And that's why this does give us a moment where if we do our job, and by that I'm saying all of our viewers, listen to the speech, study these ideas, and join with us to de-brainwash your fellow citizens. That's what it's going to take to win this fight.
Another question, and actually, as I put this up, Jose, or to go through this question, if you have How Gazette LaRouche urgent appeal by citizens and institutions from all over the world. Do you have that there?
I can pull that up in just a second.
Okay, very good. It's okay. I can ask the question in between. It's not something we have to read at the moment. So here's because the question references something which is in the text of that document, and I will refer to a section of that document. And Harley, you might describe what the document is also. So the question is from Delia. She asks, thank you for today's very important discussion. I think the Cuba crisis should be called the Turkey crisis because what happened next was a reaction to this. Now, and what's your opinion? She asks. Now, in the document written by Helga, which begins by referring to the 60th anniversary of the American University speech, she points out that President Kennedy gave that speech less than a year that's in the year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, very good. The text is here. In the middle of the Cold War, but he was able to elevate his listeners to see above the political conflict and to look at the interest of humanity as a whole. Now, here's a passage. You can also highlight this now. Today, we are faced with a strategic situation far more dangerous than that at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Offensive NATO weapon systems are much closer to the border of Russia than Cuba is to the United States. Now, think about that. Cuba is 90 miles away from the United States. So just think about that. Cuba is the same distance from the United States as New York City is from Philadelphia, more or less. The destructive power of the NATO weapons is even greater, the warning time before their launch shorter, and the trust between the leaders of the big nuclear powers is virtually non-existent compared to that between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The doomsday clock has been set by the bulletin of the atomic scientists at 90 seconds before midnight, and that may be overly optimistic. Okay, so the question is referring to the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'll just read it again because Harley will know the reference, and it's something that we will have to describe to people. So the question was, I think the Cuba crisis could be called the Turkey crisis because of what happened next, which was a reaction to this. So Harley?
Well, I believe this is a reference to the fact that the agreement between Khrushchev and Kennedy, the public agreement was that the Soviets agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba. The private discussion was that the United States, the Kennedy, recognizing that Khrushchev was under enormous pressure from his military-industrial complex, needed something to show in return for that. And so the U.S. agreed to remove U.S. missiles, I believe the Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey, to remove them as part of a quid pro quo, but not to make that a public recognition. Now, the importance here is not so much the trade-off of Cuban missiles versus missiles in Turkey, although, as Ray pointed out, the defense systems that are really offense systems that are being deployed into Romania and Poland, and the possibility of Ukraine and NATO would put Western offensive nuclear weapons right on the border of Russia. So the question that came up for Kennedy was, how do you get away from this? What do you do besides trading off weapons? What is necessary to have a peace? And that's why the language is so important about recognizing the struggle of the Russian people in World War II. Even though we didn't agree with their system, we recognized their courage and their honor as American allies against the Nazis. Now, that idea should be, let me put it differently, that idea is being trampled on by the Western support for neo-Nazi elements inside Ukraine. The fact that the West could not even join Russia in this year's Victory in Europe celebrations on May 9th, May 10th, but use that as a point to attack the Russians for the war in Ukraine, just shows the extent to which what Kennedy understood about the strategic problems and the necessity to recognize that the Russians, the Soviets, had important strategic considerations, security considerations, as did the United States with missiles in Cuba. Today, what President Putin kept saying in his attempt to negotiate is you should recognize that we have a legitimate security interest in not having neo-Nazis in Ukraine who just pulled off a coup backed by the United States, armed with nuclear weapons on our border. The West refused to consider that a legitimate security interest. And so I'm not sure that's what Dahlia meant in the question, but I think that's how I would answer it.
Very good. There's a question from Steve, and he's asking, to what extent has the Durham report crippled, slowed, or derailed Biden regime war efforts?
Well, I would say it has not done anything so far, although it's important that it came out. I think on a number of things, Durham pulled his punches. Because look, what does it report? It reports what we were saying from the beginning of Russiagate, from the summer of 2016. I wrote dozens of articles in 2017, 2018, exposing the corruption of the intelligence community, the Democratic Party, and the Congress as a whole in allowing the Russiagate story to get out. But our point from the beginning was that this was not just a product of Hillary Clinton and corrupt Democrats, but was a coordinated effort centered in London and the United States and Washington and Wall Street. The London side of it was obvious. It wasn't just the Christopher Steele report. It was the whole setup, including Joseph Mifsud and other characters who were spreading the word that the Russians were the ones who hacked the DNC and gave the documents to WikiLeaks and so on. So we reported on this. This story was out there. It came up in the Congress. Devin Nunes and others put some of this out. But it hasn't made a difference. The mainstream media is still talking about Russia's interference in the 2016 election. Now, I think over time, this will have more of an impact, but not in itself, because for many people, this is old news, old history. But it's not. It's the same network that was running Russiagate, targeting, and it wasn't just targeting Donald Trump, it was targeting the idea that the United States and Russia could be friends and allies. That was the target. That was the issue that concerned the British geopoliticians and their American allies the most. The idea that there could be a break from this unipolar order through collaboration and cooperation, and not just with Russia, but with China. So I think the Durham report is useful as far as it goes, but it's not getting the attention it should. The approach of the media is to say it's a big nothing burger and that it's just Republican talking points to defend Donald Trump. But actually, it does show the interconnection between the intelligence community, in this case, the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party, and the media. And as I said earlier, it's the same thing that was exposed in the Columbia Journalism Review by Jeffrey Gerth, which hardly anyone noticed. So if there's going to be some traction with this, it will depend on the American people insisting that we want to know who's behind the war drive against Russia in Ukraine. Why is it that there's no negotiation? Why is it that we flat out refuse to take the Chinese offer or the offer from Lula or the offer from the Vatican to negotiate? Why are we so insistent obsessively on continuing this war? And I think that will bring, in that context, the Durham report can provide some useful background information.
I'll just make a quick comment, really not about, because if we don't, I want to keep with the just questions, but Key point about what happened there is the Durham report is largely useless. However, it does show that the FBI had no business doing the investigation of Donald Trump in the first place. It did show that the FBI is a political police. It did show that the FBI was, quote, weaponized against that particular campaign. But it also showed the nature of the FBI that this organization has fought and had to fight ever since really the 1970s. And it's something that is important because many of the very Republicans that today are denouncing the FBI were vociferous proponents and supporters of it when the FBI was conducting equally illegal and sometimes murderous investigations of others in the country with whom they did not politically agree. What's important here, however, is that that having been done, there's a second element. The big fraud here, which is being committed by the media covering the Durham report, is even a greater fraud than merely trying to turn it into an electoral process. It's that there was never any capacity for such Russian hacks to ever occur. And that's something that Ray Mcgovern and Larry Johnson, various other people, Bill Binney and others have discussed, these people being former CIA or National Security Agency. And that will be the great expose when that expose is given traction. It was exposed at the time. But just to say, this doesn't mean one should dismiss the Durham report. I'm saying something different, which is to understand that the United States population often wishes to know things which it already knows and claims to not know things that it already knows because of the responsibility of doing something about those things if you admit that you do know. And I just want to point that out. I mean, this organization certainly spent from particularly 2016 to 2021, really, with nonstop coverage of precisely this, as Harley already alluded. And so it just should be.
Dennis, if I could just add something to that also, we knew this because of the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche, the same corrupt FBI working with intelligence sources, working with both leaders of both parties in the 1980s, targeted Lyndon LaRouche using the same kind of fraudulent charges. Some claiming LaRouche was a Soviet agent, some saying he was a Nazi, all kinds of bogus stories. And if you really want to get something with traction that can take the Durham report into a higher manifold, we have to have the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, because it was the attack on LaRouche which set up the mechanism and the machine that was used in Russiagate, but also that was key to the collapse of when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the potential for a cooperation, a JFK-style cooperation was available then. Lyndon LaRouche was sitting in prison because the FBI put him there, and the permanent bureaucracy, the bureaucratic fascism, as LaRouche often called it, was deployed to silence him. So that's the ultimate significance of this, that we have to get the LaRouche story out, because that will fill out much more clearly what we're up against and what we've been up against since the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
This is a question which was originally for Ray, but I'm going to ask you, Harley, because I think it's relevant to the discussion we're having now. This is from Ari, and it's what's asked. He's asking, what would Mr. McGovern recommend to our government deep state agencies today? How are they getting it or not getting it? I think and he says, what can be changed, or will it always be this way? That's his question.
Ray, on a previous Manhattan Project event, said we should disestablish the CIA. I don't know if he extended that to the FBI also, but I think he probably would. And I think what he means by that is that the violation of the original orders by which the CIA was set up is that it was an intelligence agency, but not to be engaged in actions. And this, of course, we see from the assassinations that have been carried out, CIA spying on Americans and so on. All of this is a violation of the original charter of the CIA. Now, should we go back to that, or what's the issue here? Well, the issue here is that we have to define what are America's interests first. Do we need a secret police state to protect the United States? Who are we protecting it from? The idea that Russia and China are bent on destroying America is a complete fraud. If you want to look at the agencies that are destroying America, you have to look at and it's not the whole FBI and the whole CIA, but the key networks. You can start with the 51 people, for example, who signed the Hunter Biden letter where they said that the Hunter Biden story is classic Russian disinformation. People who believe these things should face some accountability for the lies that they used. Some of the agents who were involved in these operations should be facing prison time. So, I think minimally you have to have accountability, which has not come from the Durham report because there were only a couple of minor indictments. So, you need a full investigation, maybe, as some people were talking about, a revival of the Church Committee that investigated CIA and FBI corruption in the 70s, 1975, I think. But even that was overridden in large part by the Bush machine operating within the Republican Party. So, what we're really talking about is a transformation of the American political environment. And it's not going to come from within the institutions. It has to come from the people.
All right. Now, this is a question which, again, I'm going to have to editorialize here. I asked the question, and then I want to say something about something about the premise here. It's from Steve, and he asks, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS and the Global South support comprehensive economic development, where trade is done via national currencies. What an RFK Gabbard, RFK and Tulsi Gabbard ticket support this policy for the United States. So let me just say something very clearly to everybody listening. Please do not try to get this organization to support candidacies for president. We had a candidate for president 8 times. We were very clear about why that was the standard of the presidency. This does not mean that we're not prepared to comment on various things about various people. But there's a reason for our saying this. And it has to do with what we've been discussing pretty much throughout about the issue of tragedy and why we call this truth or war, not peace or war. And it has to do with the American people. Yeah. Right now, there is no possibility, please, that there is a solution that's going to come from any one individual or even group of individuals in the United States in the present configuration. If you do not act and don't act now, then that is the issue. In terms of the issue of Robert Kennedy Jr., just to make this clear, I just want to be clear, everybody. What we are doing in featuring what he said is, first of all, because of what he said concerning Ukraine. Secondly, some of us are aware that Kennedys have a propensity to get killed. And therefore, there is a certain public service served to all presidential candidates in allowing, particularly this candidate, to speak when he's been identified as a kook, an extremist, a vaxxer, an anti-vaxxer rather, etc. But then you get somebody who's able to make a cogent statement over a period of 8 minutes, answering a question. The American people never get to hear that, or either don't want to hear it, but here's somebody who puts it forward, and there's often also other content. And in this particular case, as much as Russell Brand may not be your cup of whatever, humor or whatever, this is a person that is asking at least an intelligent question. And then he gets an answer, which he didn't bargain for, but it's an important answer. So this is something that the LaRouche movement has always done. It's always been different in that regard. But this can't be placed in a packaged formula for how to solve a problem that you aren't going to solve yourself. It will not be solved for you. And I say this because that mistake, that flaw, is why we are where we are. And I'll just say one last thing. I think the biggest crime of the people, the 50 people that signed on to the Hunter Biden laptop saying that it was fraudulent, is their use of the term classic. The greatest crime is the use of the term classic disinformation. They have no idea what classical means. They are misleading the people of the United States in this. And what should be done is they should all be sentenced to a set of lectures or discussions that should be done on the classical principle that, frankly, people like us should do, since they are actually, it would probably torture them to know what that term actually means. So sorry about that, Harley. Just wanted to take that because I thought it was important, since we've got kind of a little bit of a creeping tendency, both here and otherwise, on this Kennedy question, just to make everybody clear what we are and what we are not doing. Okay.
Well, in a sense, the classic cop-out is to say, which candidate should we support? And as Lynn often joked about it, but he said in all seriousness, it's not like a selection of the sport team you want to cheer for, because it's, as you just said, it's not a candidate per se. It's the emanation from the population of a demand that the nation correct itself. And if you have a candidate who is moving in that direction, fine. But up to this point, it hasn't happened. The only one we had was Lyndon LaRouche. And I think if people actually knew what Lynn was doing and saying in those 8 presidential terms or campaigns, they would feel that the tragedy was that he never became president, because he was eminently qualified, and he was, as he often said, the only one qualified to hold the office in these circumstances. So I just second what Dennis said. The question is not who are we going to support. The question is, what will we do to be worthy of a candidate who actually does reflect that tradition of the United States?
Okay, this is a question, Harley, which comes from, I think this might be from Kynan, Earlier, it was said that there was no such thing as current events, and that the reason most people get caught below the level of events is because they don't have a conception of the historical context in which the events are taking place. William Shakespeare provided a framework from which to think this way through his history plays, which were written to show the flaws in past English leadership and the way from which those axiomatic flaws could be corrected. Continuing on this discussion of classical tragedy, could Harley comment on his work in studying Shakespeare's history plays, particularly Richard III, and that in the relevance of these plays for understanding the situation today?
Well, I thank Kynan for the question, and this actually could be a whole subject of another Manhattan Project event, because as Lyndon LaRouche pointed out, the history plays and the tragedies of Shakespeare provided the basis for Lincoln mobilizing his cabinet to act to defend the nation at a point where it was threatened with breaking apart. The most relevant thing I can say just in the short term is that what Shakespeare showed through the so-called history plays, which go from Richard II through Richard III, and include the War of the Roses, the incredible insight that he had to show that it was outside control that determined what happened with the kingdom. And that came to an end, at least briefly, with the Henry VII, Henry Tudor, overthrowing Richard III. The famous one for me, the one I speak about quite often, is the fact that many conservative Republicans latch on to the idea of Henry V because they say he was like George W. Bush. They actually use this as an example. He was a bit of a cut-up, a drunkard, had all kinds of personal problems while he was the prince. But once he became king, he became a leader in war and led England to a triumph over France. Now, people who say things like that never read the next play, Henry VI, Part 1, where it opens with a new king at a moment of profound crisis, in which they'd lost the gains in France from Henry V. England was falling apart, and his heir was I think, an 11-month-old son. So the whole point in Shakespeare's play was to say, don't put your trust in this one leader. And again, this is a very powerful, I mean, Henry V in the beginning, before he launches the wars in France, it's clear that he's being manipulated by corrupt networks in the church to launch these wars so they can protect their power. So these are really strategic documents that have profound insight into the problems of a population, which looks to royalty and looks to monarchy for solutions. And in the aftermath of the recent coronation, I think it would do for all the people in the United Kingdom who are complaining about Charles III, the new king, while they're all right that he should never be king, it would be very useful to go back through the history plays to see to what extent it reflects a systemic problem within the idea of a constitutional monarchy.
I just would like to point out also, I happen to have, well, one of the books, this actually isn't the one I was looking for, but Saint Thomas More had a guardian, Thomas More being the philosophical associate of Erasmus and an advisor to Henry VIII. But his guardian gave him first-hand accounts of the actual conflict involving Richard III and Henry VII. More then wrote an extensive history on Richard III. And it was that history which served as one of the primary sources for Shakespeare's play. So when we talk about this, you see, these plays are one of the great other crimes is of recent culture. The last 60 years have almost nothing to do with any of the settings that people know these plays to be. I don't mean that they're necessarily miscast in terms of particulars of scenery and things like that, but I mean that they are rooted in historical studies, which doesn't mean that everything is mappable onto particular people, but it's just important for people to understand the origin of these. And I just wanted to reference that. And the article that people can look at that talks about their various of those things is Lyndon LaRouche's Politics as Art. It was written in November, I think November 6th of 2000. And you can get that on the Executive Intelligence Review website. We're coming to the end. We have to sort of begin to wind up. There are a couple of other questions, which I just want to check. Just a minute. Well, there's a question which is actually a good place for us to summarize. But before we do that, I just got a note here saying that some of the people who've been watching said that the Kennedy speech made them cry. There was an experience that I had with another very much younger person some years back with the first inaugural of Kennedy, which is also like that, because they never heard an American president that even spoke about any of those sorts of matters or spoke in that way. But the question is, which I think I'll make our last one, is from Tony. And the question is there any hope left for world peace?
There better be, because otherwise we're talking about the annihilation of mankind. Now, the reason there is hope, and I think this is something that I tried to bring forward in the brief discussion I had of the emergence of the discussion in the Global South of a orientation toward economic development, what we see from China, what we see from Russia. And let me simply say that to many of you who dismiss that because you say, well, Russia and China are in on it, they're part of the World Economic Forum, That's just bunk. You're missing the whole point of why there's such an effort to destroy these two countries. And that this goes back long before communism. It goes back to the great game that was carried out by the British against Russia in the middle of the 19th century, which you can look up in the form of the Charge of the Light Brigade. So, what we're talking about is long waves of history, a historical dynamic that is not understood by probably 99% of the population. What happens when people start getting to realize that they've been lied to? And I think this is, again, the importance of the Durham report, the importance of our work in particular on this, is that we can show you explicitly how you've been lied to and who did it and why. But once you know that, it's not enough to smugly sit there and say, I knew these guys were bad. I knew there was a conspiracy. No, the actual conspiracy is to keep you from acting by assuming that these guys are so powerful. This quote I read you from the Ukrainian news service about how the Ukrainian anti-missile defense system proved that Russia is weak. This is the kind of idiocy that is leading to the annihilation of much of the population of Ukraine. So how do you overcome that? And the only way, and this is a point that Lyndon LaRouche always made, is you have to speak to people directly and to cut through the surface and to realize that oftentimes people who talk most boldly about subjects are doing it to cover up the fear that they don't know what they're talking about. And if you are committed to organizing for a new strategic architecture and a new financial economic development architecture, and you know what you're talking about, then you have to combine that with what you saw coming through in the Kennedy speech, which was a love of the nation. That the most powerful emotion to evoke is a love of a parent for the children, of a nation for its population, of the potential for development that exists and resides in every single human being. And it's that quality of agape, which you see in Shakespeare, which you see in really powerfully in Friedrich Schiller's plays and his overall writings. That commitment to uplifting the soul of the other person, inspiring them to act on their better instincts. That's why we have a chance. That's where optimism comes from. Not because we have such great forces out there or such, powerful arguments on our side. No, the fact that human beings have within them a potential to act for the future and on their better instincts. And the question is developing the capability in ourselves, overcoming our own imperfections, our own hubris, so that we can reach that inner quality, inner spiritual quality in other human beings. That's where the optimism can come from.
I want to thank you, Harley, for being with us. And of course, we want to thank Ray Mcgovern, who has been with us several times, co-founder of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We want to thank everybody for being with us today. And we would ask that over the next 3 weeks, a certain kind of initiative be taken around the June 10th speech. Helga Sepp LaRouche has written this urgent appeal to the next president of the United States. You see it there. That's available on the website. And also her earlier document, which is the sort of how we got to here, which is her 10 principles for a new strategic international security and development architecture. If you haven't seen these, please go get them. But specifically on this piece, it's very useful to read that and then read the shorter piece, the urgent appeal, in that context, because this is a form of what's called statecraft. It's a practice that was very characteristic of 15th century, 16th century diplomacy, but was also characteristic of diplomacy by the informed in the 17th century as well. people like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and others engaged in this idea of a diplomacy that was based on the highest levels of thought. And many books and other things that are today thought of as being merely abstract treatises were written in the context of conducting precisely that kind of diplomacy. In a semi-literate, near dark age, longer treatises of that type aren't easily assimilated. But the actions that we're trying to take in this context to cause the American people to understand how to take back their government, we think should be adopted by those that are listening to us. May 29th is Memorial Day, and that's a good day to try to remember what America is. People seem to have forgotten it on Victory in Europe Day this year, May 8th, 9th. There was very little of any kind of even recall of the Second World War. In fact, there was a denunciation of Russia for asserting that it would hold its normal present commemorations of that date. We'll see this Memorial Day whether the American people even can remember the United States. And I'd just like to say that that speech from June 10th is a useful inflection point. It is likely, in fact, I would say it's essentially definite that there will be a conference that our organization will hold that day, which we will invite everybody to be with us. Some things have to be worked out about that, but will certainly be available by webcast at that day on that Saturday, which I think is 3 weeks from today. So on behalf of the LaRouche Organization, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. We'll see you again next week.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.